Tonight, we're diving into a story that will make you question everything about trust, obsession, and the lies people tell themselves when they're waiting for a promise that will never come true. This is the story of Jerome Butler, a 62-year-old man who spent a quarter of a century as the hidden lover of a married woman, believing that one day, just one day, she would leave her husband and choose him. But when a younger man entered the picture, Jerome's patience shattered, and what happened next would shake Riverside Grove to its core. So ask yourself this: if you discovered that the person you sacrificed everything for, the person you built your entire life around, was replacing you with someone else, what would you do? Would you walk away? Or would something inside you snap? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because by the end of this story, you'll understand just how dangerous obsession can become when love turns into possession. This is True Crimes Alter, where love turns lethal, family secrets unravel, and truth explodes into violence. If you're drawn to haunting true crime stories told with raw emotion and gripping detail, subscribe now, share this video, and let us know your thoughts below. The magnolia trees bloomed each spring with predictable beauty in Riverside Grove. The Friday night football games drew crowds that spilled onto the surrounding lawns, and Sunday mornings meant one thing: church. The red brick Baptist church on Maple Street had stood for over a century, its white steeple piercing the sky like a finger pointing toward heaven. Inside its walls, the community gathered not just for worship, but for fellowship, gossip, and the quiet reinforcement of social bonds that held the town together. Jerome Butler had lived in Riverside Grove his entire life. At 62 years old, he was a fixture in the community, a man whose hands had built half the porches, decks, and kitchen cabinets in town. He was a master carpenter, known for his precision, his patience, and his gentle demeanor. Folks trusted Jerome. They invited him into their homes, shared coffee with him while he worked, and never suspected that beneath his calm exterior lived a man harboring a secret that had defined his entire adult life. Jerome was a bachelor, or at least that was what everyone believed. What they didn't know was that Jerome had been in love with the same woman for 25 years. Her name was Vanessa Monroe, and she was married to someone else. Vanessa Monroe was 56 years old, a striking woman who owned Monroe Realty, the most successful real estate agency in Riverside Grove. She was sharp, ambitious, and respected in the business community. But Vanessa's greatest accomplishment, at least in the eyes of Riverside Grove, was her marriage to Ronald Monroe. Ronald was 59 years old, a deacon at the Maple Street Baptist Church, and a man whose presence commanded respect. He worked as a senior accountant, sang in the church choir, led Bible study on Wednesday nights, and could be counted on to organize the annual church picnic every June. Ronald and Vanessa had been married for 32 years and had raised 3 children together. To everyone who knew them, the Monroes were the model couple. But behind the facade of their perfect marriage was a truth that would have destroyed Ronald if he had known it. For 25 years, since 1994, Vanessa had been carrying on an affair with Jerome Butler. And Ronald Monroe had absolutely no idea. The affair had started in the summer of 1994 when Vanessa hired Jerome to renovate the kitchen in the Monroe home. Ronald had been traveling frequently for work, and Vanessa had been lonely, overwhelmed with raising 3 young children largely on her own. Jerome was 37 years old then, with kind eyes and a quiet confidence that put Vanessa at ease. As the renovation progressed, their conversations grew deeper and more personal. Vanessa confided in Jerome about her marriage, about how Ronald's constant travel made her feel like a single parent. Jerome listened without judgment, offering sympathy and understanding. By the 3rd week of the renovation, the attraction was undeniable. On a Thursday afternoon in early July 1994, when the children were at summer camp, Vanessa made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. They made love that afternoon, and afterward, Vanessa told Jerome that she wasn't happy in her marriage, that she had been thinking about divorce, and that eventually, she would leave Ronald and they could be together properly. Jerome had believed her. And so their affair began, built on a foundation of stolen moments and whispered promises. Over the years that followed, Jerome became a constant presence in Vanessa's life, though always in the shadows. He became her confidant, her emotional support, and eventually, a surrogate father figure to her children. The Monroe kids grew up knowing Jerome as the friendly carpenter who was always around. They called him Uncle Jerome, and they adored him. Ronald, too, considered Jerome a friend. It was a masterclass in deception, and both Jerome and Vanessa had perfected their roles. But beneath the surface, Jerome was always waiting for Vanessa to make good on her promise. The years kept passing, and Vanessa's promises remained unfulfilled. There was always a reason, always an excuse. In 2000, she said the timing wasn't right because Ronald had just been promoted. In 2005, her youngest daughter was about to graduate high school. In 2010, Ronald's mother had just passed away. In 2015, the real estate market was in flux and she needed Ronald's financial stability. Jerome always believed her, or perhaps more accurately, he chose to believe her because the alternative was too painful to confront. By 2019, Jerome was 62 years old, and he had spent more than half his life waiting for a woman who belonged to someone else. But what Jerome didn't know was that his 25 years of patience, loyalty, and sacrifice were about to be tested in a way he could never have imagined. Because in the fall of 2019, Vanessa Monroe was about to meet someone new. Someone younger. Someone who would threaten everything Jerome believed was his. In October 2019, Riverside Grove held its annual Harvest Festival. Jerome set up a booth to display his custom woodworking pieces. Vanessa was there too with her real estate booth, and Ronald was by her side for most of the morning. Jerome watched them from his booth, a familiar ache settling in his chest. Around noon, Ronald left to help with the church's charity auction. As Jerome talked with Vanessa, a man approached her booth. He was younger, probably in his early 40s, with a lean build, a clean-shaven head, and a disarming smile. Jerome noticed him immediately because of the way Vanessa's demeanor shifted the moment she saw him. Her smile brightened. Her posture straightened. The man's name was Darius Thompson, and he had just moved to Riverside Grove 2 weeks earlier. He was a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, looking to buy a house in the area. Vanessa's eyes lit up, and she immediately launched into her pitch. Jerome stood there, feeling suddenly invisible. There was a spark in Vanessa's eyes that he hadn't seen in years, a flirtatiousness in her tone that made his chest tighten with unease. Darius was charming. He asked questions about the town, laughed easily at Vanessa's jokes, and complimented her business. Vanessa seemed to bask in his attention, leaning in slightly as she spoke, her hand occasionally brushing his arm. After about 10 minutes, Darius said he would stop by her office the following week. As he walked away, Vanessa watched him go, a small smile playing on her lips. For the rest of the festival, Jerome found it difficult to focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to the way Vanessa had looked at Darius Thompson. He told himself he was overreacting, but the doubt had been planted, and it would only grow in the days and weeks to come. The following Monday, Darius walked into Monroe Realty. Vanessa had cleared her schedule for the entire morning and had taken extra care with her appearance. For the next hour, they talked about properties, but Darius shared personal details that went beyond usual client small talk. Vanessa found herself drawn into the conversation in a way that surprised her. When their meeting wrapped up, Darius asked if she would show him some properties later that week. Vanessa agreed immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, Darius became a regular presence in Vanessa's life. As they spent afternoons looking at properties, the conversation shifted from business to personal. Vanessa found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't expected. By the time they returned to the office after one showing, Darius suggested they grab coffee sometime, just to talk, no business involved. Vanessa hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. Their coffee date happened the following week at a small cafe on the edge of town. They sat in a corner booth, talking for over 2 hours. Darius was charming, attentive, and genuinely interested in everything Vanessa had to say. He made her laugh, made her feel seen, and for the first time in years, Vanessa felt like someone was truly listening to her. It was during that conversation that Vanessa realized she was attracted to Darius. It was the way he made her feel valued, interesting, alive. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced with Ronald in decades, And if she was being honest with herself, it was a feeling that had started to fade with Jerome as well. Jerome, for all his devotion and loyalty, had become predictable. Darius, on the other hand, was new, mysterious, and full of possibilities. By late November 2019, Vanessa and Darius had crossed the line from friendship into something more. It happened on a Friday evening after Vanessa had shown him another property. Instead of returning to the office, Darius invited her to his temporary apartment. Vanessa knew she shouldn't go, but she went anyway, drawn by a desire she couldn't ignore. They had wine. They talked. And then, inevitably, they kissed. The guilt she expected to feel never came. Instead, she felt exhilarated, reckless, and more alive than she had in years. Jerome, meanwhile, was beginning to notice the changes in Vanessa. She was less available than usual, often too busy to meet him on their regular evenings together. When they did see each other, she seemed distracted. Jerome attributed it to stress at work and the demands of her marriage. He didn't suspect there was someone else because the idea was unthinkable. But by early December 2019, Jerome's suspicions began to solidify. He had driven past Monroe Realty one evening and seen Vanessa leaving with Darius. They were laughing, standing close together, and when Darius opened the car door for her, the gesture felt intimate in a way that made Jerome's blood run cold. For the first time in 25 years, Jerome felt a crack in the foundation of his trust. He began to notice things he had missed before. The way Vanessa's phone buzzed constantly with messages she didn't answer in his presence. The way she seemed happier, lighter. The way she mentioned Darius's name more often than seemed necessary, always in the context of work, but with a tone that suggested something more. By mid-December, Jerome could no longer ignore the truth. Vanessa was seeing someone else. And that someone was Darius Thompson. The realization hit Jerome like a physical blow. For 25 years, he had waited for Vanessa. He had sacrificed his own happiness, his own chance at a normal life, because he believed in her promises. And now, after all that, she had chosen someone else. Not Ronald, not Jerome, but a man who had been in town for less than 2 months. Jerome's hands trembled as he typed out a message to Vanessa. "We need to talk." Vanessa responded an hour later, "Can't tonight. Ronald's home." "Tomorrow?" Jerome stared at the message, his jaw clenched. "Ronald's home." As though that mattered. Jerome had spent 25 years accommodating Ronald's presence, and now Vanessa was using Ronald as an excuse to avoid him when the real reason was Darius. The next day, Vanessa met Jerome at their usual spot, a small park on the outskirts of town. It was a cold December afternoon. She slid into the passenger seat of Jerome's truck, and before she could say hello, Jerome turned to her with a look that made her breath catch. He asked her directly, "Are you seeing someone else?" Vanessa's eyes widened. She looked away, her hands twisting in her lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She told him that she had met someone, that it wasn't serious yet, but that she felt a connection with Darius she couldn't ignore. She said she hadn't planned for it to happen and that she didn't know what it meant for them. Jerome listened, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He reminded her of the 25 years they had spent together, of the promises she had made, of the life they were supposed to have. He asked her how she could throw all of that away for someone she had just met. Vanessa didn't have a good answer. She said she was sorry, that she needed time to figure out what she wanted. But her apologies felt hollow, and Jerome could see the truth in her eyes. She had already made her choice. She was choosing Darius. The conversation ended badly, with Jerome's voice rising in anger and Vanessa's tears doing nothing to soften the blow. She left the truck, slamming the door behind her, and Jerome sat alone in the park, his heart shattered. In the days that followed, Jerome tried to carry on as though nothing had happened. But inside, he was unraveling. The betrayal consumed him. He couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa and Darius, couldn't stop imagining them together. For the first time in his life, he felt something dark and dangerous stirring inside him. It wasn't just anger. It was rage. And beneath the rage was a grief so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. By the end of December 2019, Jerome had made a decision. He wasn't going to let Darius Thompson take Vanessa away from him. Jerome began to watch Darius more closely, learning his routines, his habits, his schedule. He noted when Darius left for work, when he returned, where he went on weekends. Jerome told himself he was just gathering information, but deep down he knew his surveillance was about more than that. It was about control. It was about finding a way to reclaim what he believed was his. As the new year began, Jerome's obsession with Darius intensified. He drove past Darius's apartment at odd hours, watched him from a distance at community events, and even followed him to the gym. The more Jerome watched, the more his anger grew. Darius seemed to have everything: youth, confidence, charm, and now Vanessa. In January 2020, Jerome saw them together again. He had been driving through town when he spotted Vanessa's car parked outside a restaurant. Jerome pulled into a parking spot across the street and waited. 20 minutes later, Vanessa emerged, and she wasn't alone. Darius was with her, his hand resting on the small of her back. When they reached the car, Darius leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a quick peck. It was a slow, deliberate kiss. Jerome watched from across the street, his vision narrowing to that single, devastating image. That night, Jerome sat alone in his house and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He thought about everything he had sacrificed for Vanessa, the relationships he had never pursued, the family he had never built, the life he had put on hold year after year because he believed in her promise. And for what? To be replaced by a man who had known her for barely 3 months? Jerome's grief turned to something darker that night, something colder, something that whispered that if he couldn't have Vanessa, then neither could Darius Thompson. By February 2020, Jerome's life had become a shadow of what it once was. His work began to suffer. He missed deadlines for the first time in his career and delivered projects that lacked his usual precision. Jerome's days now revolved around a singular obsession: tracking Darius Thompson's movements. He kept a notebook in his truck where he recorded times, locations, and observations with meticulous detail. The realization that he had become irrelevant in Vanessa's life after 25 years of devotion was more painful than Jerome could have imagined. Jerome's surveillance grew bolder as February turned into March. He no longer cared about being discreet. He would park his truck across the street from Darius's apartment and watch the windows. He saw Vanessa there often, sometimes staying for an hour, sometimes not leaving until the next morning. On a cold evening in mid-March, Jerome followed Darius to a bar on the outskirts of Riverside Grove. He watched through the window as Darius sat at the bar and ordered a drink. After about 20 minutes, Vanessa arrived. She spotted Darius immediately, her face lighting up with a smile. She slid onto the stool beside Darius, and he greeted her with a kiss. Jerome stood outside in the cold, watching as they laughed and talked, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that spoke of intimacy and comfort. He stayed there for over an hour, unable to look away even though every moment was agony. When Vanessa and Darius finally left the bar, they walked to Darius's car with their arms around each other. Jerome followed them back to Darius's apartment and sat in his truck, imagining what was happening behind those walls. That night, a new thought began to form. If talking to Vanessa wouldn't work, maybe he needed to talk to Darius. Maybe he needed to make Darius understand that Vanessa wasn't available, that he needed to back off. The opportunity came sooner than Jerome expected. On a Thursday evening in late March, Jerome spotted Darius at the grocery store. Jerome followed at a distance, and when Darius headed toward the checkout, Jerome positioned himself in line directly behind him. When Darius finished paying and started toward the exit, Jerome followed him into the parking lot. Jerome called out to him. Darius turned, looking polite but slightly confused. Jerome introduced himself, extending his hand. Jerome explained that he was a friend of Vanessa's, that they had known each other for many years, and that he wanted to talk to Darius about her. Darius's expression shifted, wariness creeping into his eyes. Jerome struggled to keep his tone calm. He said he cared about Vanessa and that he thought Darius should know she was a married woman. Darius's jaw tightened, and he said he was aware of Vanessa's situation, that it wasn't Jerome's business, and that he needed to leave. But Jerome didn't leave. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense tone. He told Darius that Vanessa had made promises to him, that they had a history that went back decades, and that Darius was interfering in something he didn't understand. Darius told Jerome to stay away from him and to stay away from Vanessa. Then he turned and walked to his car. The confrontation had not gone the way Jerome had hoped. He drove home that night feeling humiliated and foolish, but also angrier than he had been before. The next day, Jerome received a text message from Vanessa. It was curt and cold. She told him that Darius had mentioned their encounter, that Jerome's behavior was unacceptable and that he needed to stop. She said that what they had was over and he needed to accept that and move on. Jerome read the message over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. What they had was over. After 25 years, Vanessa was ending it with a text message. Jerome didn't respond. The rage and grief swirling inside him were too overwhelming to put into words. In early April 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic suddenly became an immediate reality. Georgia issued stay-at-home orders, businesses closed, and people retreated into their homes. Riverside Grove emptied out almost overnight. For Jerome, the pandemic was both a curse and a strange kind of blessing. His carpentry business came to a near standstill, but the isolation gave him more time to focus on the one thing that consumed his every waking thought: Darius Thompson. Jerome noticed that Vanessa's visits to Darius's apartment became more frequent during the lockdown. With Ronald working from home and the real estate market frozen, Vanessa had fewer legitimate reasons to be out, but she still found ways to slip away. Each sighting confirmed what Jerome already knew. Vanessa had fully committed to Darius, and Jerome had been completely erased from her life. The isolation of the pandemic also gave Jerome too much time to think, too much time to dwell on his anger and his pain. He stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. Jerome's fantasies grew darker as April wore on. He imagined confronting Darius again with more force. He imagined scenarios where Darius simply disappeared, where the problem solved itself and Vanessa came back to him. But fantasies weren't enough anymore. Jerome wanted action. Jerome wanted resolution. On a warm evening in late April, Jerome made a decision. He had been sitting in his truck, parked down the street from Darius's apartment, watching Vanessa's car in the lot. She had been inside for over 3 hours. Something inside him snapped. Jerome reached into the glove compartment of his truck and pulled out a small handgun. He had owned the weapon for years, purchased decades ago for home protection but never used. Now, as he held the cold metal in his hand, Jerome felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The decision had been made. He told himself he just wanted to have it, to feel prepared, to have some sense of control. But deep down, Jerome knew that bringing the gun meant he was crossing a line. It meant he was preparing for something final. May 2020 brought a slight easing of restrictions in Georgia. Businesses reopened, people ventured out more freely, and the church resumed in-person services. Jerome attended the first service back and saw Vanessa and Ronald sitting together near the front, their heads bowed in prayer. Jerome watched them, his heart heavy. He thought about how easy it would be to stand up and expose Vanessa's affair in front of the entire congregation. But deep down, he knew that exposing Vanessa wouldn't give him what he wanted. It wouldn't bring her back to him. All it would do was destroy her, and as much as Jerome was hurting, he still loved her too much to do that. No, if Jerome was going to act, it wouldn't be against Vanessa. It would be against the man who had taken her away. It would be against Darius Thompson. As May progressed, Jerome's surveillance of Darius became more intense and more reckless. He no longer cared if he was seen. He followed Darius everywhere, always keeping just far enough back to avoid a direct confrontation, but close enough that Darius had to know he was being watched. On a Tuesday evening in mid-May, Darius confronted Jerome again. Jerome had been sitting in his truck outside the gym when Darius emerged and walked directly toward him. Jerome rolled down his window and met Darius's angry gaze. Darius demanded to know what Jerome's problem was, why he was following him, and what he hoped to accomplish. Jerome told Darius that he was a homewrecker, that he had destroyed something precious, and that he needed to leave Vanessa alone. Darius laughed, a bitter, humorless sound, and told Jerome that he was pathetic, that Vanessa had moved on, and that Jerome needed to do the same. The word pathetic echoed in Jerome's ears long after Darius walked away. It was the same word Jerome had been using to describe himself in the quiet moments when he was alone. But instead of prompting Jerome to change course, Darius's words only hardened his resolve. If he was already pathetic, if he had already lost everything, then what did he have left to lose? By late May, Jerome had made a plan. It wasn't elaborate or carefully thought out. It was simple, direct, and driven by a single, consuming need: to remove Darius from the equation. Jerome told himself that once Darius was gone, Vanessa would come back to him. It was a delusion, a fantasy born of desperation and grief, but Jerome clung to it because it was the only thing that made sense of the chaos in his mind. On the night of June 3, 2020, Jerome loaded the handgun and placed it in the glove compartment of his truck. He drove to Darius's apartment and parked in his usual spot down the street. He waited, watching the building, his hands trembling slightly despite the strange sense of calm that had settled over him. Jerome sat in his truck for over 2 hours that night, the gun a cold weight in his lap, before he finally saw movement. Darius emerged from the apartment building at 9:30, dressed in athletic clothes with a gym bag slung over his shoulder. Jerome's heart rate spiked. Without thinking, Jerome started his truck and followed, keeping a safe distance but never letting Darius out of his sight. Darius drove to the 24-hour gym on the edge of town. Jerome watched him park and head inside, and for a moment, Jerome considered turning around and going home. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to stop, to let this go, to walk away before he did something he could never take back. But that voice was drowned out by the louder, angrier voice that had taken control of his thoughts. The voice that whispered that Darius deserved this, that Jerome had every right to defend what was his, that 25 years of devotion couldn't be erased by some newcomer. Jerome sat in the parking lot, the gun now tucked into the waistband of his jeans, hidden beneath his jacket, and he waited. The gym was mostly empty at this hour. Through the large windows, Jerome could see Darius on a treadmill, running with the steady pace of someone in excellent physical condition. Jerome felt a surge of resentment. Of course Darius was fit and young and confident. Of course he represented everything Jerome wasn't, everything Jerome could never be. 45 minutes later, Darius finished his workout and headed toward the exit. Jerome's pulse pounded in his ears. This was it. This was the moment. Jerome's hand moved to the gun, his fingers wrapping around the grip, and he stepped out of his truck. The parking lot was dimly lit, with only a few overhead lights casting weak pools of illumination across the asphalt. Darius didn't notice Jerome at first. He was focused on his phone, scrolling through messages as he walked toward his car. Jerome closed the distance between them, his footsteps silent, his breathing shallow. When he was about 10 feet away, Jerome called out Darius's name. Darius looked up, and when he saw Jerome, his expression shifted from surprise to irritation to something that looked like genuine concern. He asked Jerome what he was doing there, his voice wary but not yet frightened. Jerome didn't answer. He just kept walking forward, his hands still on the gun, his mind a chaotic swirl of rage, grief, and desperation. Darius must have seen something in Jerome's eyes because he took a step back and told Jerome to calm down, to think about what he was doing. But Jerome was beyond thinking. He pulled the gun from his waistband, and the moment Darius saw it, his entire demeanor changed. The wariness turned to fear, and he raised his hands in a placating gesture, telling Jerome that whatever this was, they could talk about it, that there was no need for anyone to get hurt. But Jerome wasn't listening. He was thinking about Vanessa, about the promises she had made, about the 25 years he had wasted waiting for a future that would never come. He was thinking about the way Darius had dismissed him, called him pathetic, treated him like he was nothing. And in that moment, all the pain and humiliation and betrayal that Jerome had been carrying coalesced into a single, blinding need to make it stop. Jerome raised the gun, his hand surprisingly steady, and he aimed it at Darius's chest. Darius's eyes widened, and he said something, a plea or a protest, but Jerome didn't hear it. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the quiet parking lot, a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding buildings and seemed to hang in the air long after the bullet had left the barrel. Darius staggered backward, his hands clutching at his chest, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He tried to say something, but the words came out as a wet, gurgling sound. He took another step back, then his knees buckled and he collapsed onto the asphalt. Blood spread across his shirt in a dark, widening stain, and his breathing became ragged and labored. Jerome stood there, the gun still in his hand, watching as the life drained out of Darius Thompson. He expected to feel something, relief or satisfaction or vindication, but all he felt was a strange, hollow emptiness. The anger that had driven him to this moment was gone, evaporated like steam, leaving behind nothing but a cold, creeping realization of what he had just done. Darius's breathing slowed, each inhale more shallow than the last, and then it stopped altogether. His eyes, still open, stared sightlessly at the night sky. Jerome looked down at the body at his feet and felt nothing. No triumph, no closure, just a vast, echoing nothingness. Jerome didn't run. He didn't try to hide the gun or cover his tracks or flee the scene. He simply walked back to his truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and sat there, the gun resting on the passenger seat beside him. He stared at the gym's entrance and waited. It took about 15 minutes for someone to discover Darius's body. A woman leaving the gym stumbled upon him in the parking lot and let out a scream that pierced the night. Within moments, people were rushing out of the building, cell phones in hand, calling 911. Jerome watched it all from his truck, detached and distant, as though he were observing a scene from a movie rather than the aftermath of his own actions. The police arrived quickly, their sirens wailing as they pulled into the parking lot. Officers secured the scene, called for an ambulance even though it was clear Darius was beyond saving, and began canvassing the area for witnesses. It didn't take them long to notice Jerome's truck parked nearby, or to see Jerome sitting inside, making no attempt to leave. 2 officers approached the truck with their hands on their holsters, ordering Jerome to show his hands and step out of the vehicle. Jerome complied without resistance. When one of the officers spotted the gun on the passenger seat, they immediately drew their weapons and ordered Jerome to the ground. Jerome dropped to his knees, then lay flat on the asphalt, his arms spread wide, and he let them handcuff him without protest. As the officers hauled him to his feet and led him toward their patrol car, Jerome looked back at Darius's body, now covered with a tarp, and he felt the enormity of what he had done begin to sink in. He had killed a man. He had taken a life. And for what? For a woman who didn't love him? For a relationship that had always been built on lies and false promises? The officers read Jerome his rights and placed him in the back of the patrol car. As they drove away from the scene, Jerome caught a glimpse of the crowd that had gathered. Among the crowd, Jerome thought he saw a familiar figure, a woman with dark hair and a horrified expression, but the car moved too quickly for him to be sure. By the time the sun rose on June 4, 2020, the news of Darius Thompson's murder had spread throughout Riverside Grove. The town was now gripped by a new kind of fear. How could something like this happen in their quiet community? And how could the perpetrator be Jerome Butler, the gentle carpenter who had been a fixture in their lives for decades? The investigation moved swiftly. Jerome had made no attempt to deny his involvement, and the physical evidence was overwhelming. The police interviewed Jerome at the station, and he confessed immediately, providing a full account of what had happened and why. When the detectives asked about his motive, Jerome told them about Vanessa. He told them about the 25-year affair, about the promises that had never been kept, and about how Darius had stolen the only thing in his life that mattered. When Jerome finished speaking, they charged him with first-degree murder. The revelation of the affair sent shockwaves through Riverside Grove that were almost as powerful as the murder itself. Ronald Monroe, who had been completely unaware of his wife's infidelity, was blindsided by the news. He had known Jerome for years, had trusted him, had welcomed him into his home and considered him a friend. The realization that Jerome had been sleeping with his wife for a quarter of a century shattered Ronald in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Ronald confronted Vanessa the same day the affair became public knowledge. According to neighbors, the confrontation was explosive. Ronald demanded to know how long it had been going on, how many lies she had told, and whether any part of their marriage had been real. Vanessa, devastated by Darius's death and terrified of the consequences, tried to explain, but there was no explanation that could make sense of 25 years of betrayal. Ronald moved out of the house that same night. Within a week, he had filed for divorce, citing adultery and irreconcilable differences. He refused to speak to Vanessa and made it clear through his attorney that he wanted nothing to do with her ever again. Vanessa's life unraveled with stunning speed. Her children, now adults with families of their own, were horrified when they learned the truth about their mother's affair. The man they had known as Uncle Jerome had been their mother's lover all along. The revelation colored every memory, and it left them feeling betrayed and disgusted. 2 of the 3 children cut off contact with Vanessa entirely. Only her youngest daughter maintained a tenuous relationship, though it was strained and fragile. Monroe Realty collapsed almost overnight. Clients canceled contracts, agents quit, and the community that had once supported her business now turned their backs. Vanessa was forced to close the agency within 2 months. She put her own home on the market shortly after, unable to afford the mortgage without Ronald's income and her business revenue. She moved into a small apartment on the edge of town and lived there in near total isolation, shunned by a community that had once embraced her. The church became a place Vanessa could no longer enter. The congregation made it clear that she was not welcome. Sunday mornings were now just another reminder of everything Vanessa had lost. Jerome, meanwhile, sat in a county jail cell awaiting trial. His attorney, a public defender, tried to build a defense based on diminished capacity and extreme emotional disturbance, arguing that Jerome's mental state at the time of the shooting should be taken into consideration. But the prosecution had a strong case, and Jerome's own confession made it nearly impossible to argue innocence. In September 2020, Jerome Butler was tried and convicted of first-degree murder. The trial lasted less than a week. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically: the gun, the witnesses, the confession, and the clear premeditation evidenced by Jerome's weeks of stalking Darius. The defense tried to paint Jerome as a man driven to madness by decades of emotional manipulation, but the jury wasn't swayed. They deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Jerome was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the judge read the sentence, Jerome showed no emotion. He simply nodded, as though he had expected nothing less, and he allowed the bailiffs to lead him out of the courtroom without protest. As he was taken away, he caught sight of Vanessa sitting in the back row of the gallery. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that moment, Jerome saw the same emptiness in her eyes that he felt in his own soul. They had both lost everything, destroyed by the secrets they had kept and the lies they had told. Ronald Monroe, who had attended every day of the trial, left the courtroom without looking back. He had sold the house he had shared with Vanessa and relocated to another town where no one knew his story. He wanted to start over, to rebuild a life that wasn't haunted by betrayal and violence. His children visited him occasionally, trying to maintain some semblance of family despite the devastation, but the scars of what had happened would never fully heal. Darius Thompson's family, who had traveled from Atlanta for the trial, wept openly when the verdict was read. They had lost a son, a brother, a man whose only crime was falling for a woman who came with more baggage than anyone could have known. They spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, expressing their grief and their anger, and they called for justice not just for Darius, but for all victims of obsessive violence. In the months and years that followed, Riverside Grove struggled to make sense of what had happened. How had a 25-year affair gone unnoticed for so long? How had Jerome Butler, a man known for his calm demeanor and steady hands, become a murderer? And how many other secrets were lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful town, waiting to explode into violence? The case became a cautionary tale, a story told in hushed tones at church gatherings and community events. It was a reminder that people were capable of hiding darkness behind smiles and pleasantries, that obsession could fester for decades before erupting into tragedy, and that the consequences of betrayal extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Jerome Butler spent the rest of his days in prison, a man haunted by the choices he had made and the life he had wasted. He received no visitors, wrote no letters, and expressed no remorse for what he had done. He had believed that killing Darius would bring Vanessa back to him, that it would restore what had been taken, but all it had done was destroy whatever fragments of humanity he had left. Vanessa Monroe lived out her days in obscurity, working minimum-wage jobs to make ends meet and avoiding the gaze of anyone who might recognize her. She never remarried, never rebuilt her business, and never regained the respect she had once commanded in Riverside Grove. She was a ghost, a cautionary figure, a woman whose choices had led to death and devastation. And Darius Thompson, a man who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, who had fallen for a woman without knowing the web of lies she was caught in, was gone. His life had been stolen by a man consumed by obsession, and his family was left to grieve a loss that should never have happened. The question that lingered in the minds of everyone who heard this story was simple but profound. How far is too far when it comes to love? At what point does devotion turn into obsession? And how do we recognize the warning signs before it's too late? Jerome Butler had spent 25 years believing he was entitled to Vanessa Monroe's love, that his patience and loyalty had earned him a place in her life that no one else could claim. But love isn't something that can be earned through waiting or demanded through sacrifice. It's freely given, or it's not love at all. And when Jerome finally realized that Vanessa had never truly been his, that the promises she made were empty and the future he imagined was a fantasy, he couldn't accept it. Instead of walking away, instead of finding peace in letting go, he chose violence. And that choice didn't just destroy Darius Thompson. It destroyed Jerome himself and everyone connected to them. So here's what we want to know from you. Have you ever known someone who waited for a love that was never going to happen? Have you seen obsession disguise itself as devotion? And if you were in Jerome's position, do you think you would have recognized the moment when love turned into something dangerous? Or would you have convinced yourself, like he did, that you were justified in holding on? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because this is the kind of story that forces us to examine the line between love and possession, between patience and delusion. And if this story gripped you, if it made you think about the secrets people keep and the lengths they'll go to protect what they believe is theirs, make sure you subscribe to True Crime's Altar. We bring you the most haunting, most emotionally charged true crime stories every week, stories that don't just shock you but make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves true crime, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Whether you're tuning in from Lagos, New York, London, or anywhere else in the world, we want to hear from you. What case should we cover next? What story keeps you up at night? Tell us below, and we'll dive into the darkness together. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember that the most dangerous secrets are the ones hiding in plain sight.